Guess what? It's podcast time. Our guest today is Rick Ross. No, not that Rick Ross. Rick is an expert on cults. He's been featured on such shows as 48 Hours, and he also works with the Cult Awareness Network. It's a pleasure to have Rick on the show. Also, we'd like to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Locust Ridge LLC. If you have a graphic design need, big or small, contact Locust Ridge LLC, and you can find them at www.nicolehinkle.com. That's NICHOLLEHINKLE.com. Anyway, you guys know what to do. So without further ado, let's enjoy the show.
You're listening to Nothing's Off the Table, the podcast where nothing, well, almost nothing, is too taboo to discuss. On Nothing's Off the Table, we give everyone a say. We may not agree with or even like the topic, but we're happy to give you a voice, listen to your perspective, and maybe offer our own. Nothing's Off the Table is a Madsis Productions podcast. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on iTunes.
But anyway, Rick, thank you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So the reason we contacted you is I've had I don't want to say a fascination with cults and people coming into cults, and of course people getting out of cults, which is kind of your forte. And I know Chad has some definite interest because of.
I do.
Well, I don't want to steal your thunder. You want to.
Well, I've got somebody in my family who, I can't confirm whether or not this person's in a cult, but what limited knowledge I have, it sure seems, the behavior seems very odd. Moved into this compound, kind of distancing himself from other family members, not complete disassociation. Certainly still overly active on social media, but everything's about this place that he now lives. I have no idea if there's some, if he's paying any rent there, but I know, posting things, hey, I've been given duties, and it seems odd to me.
Well, I think it's important that people realize that one of the most crucial elements that you can think of when you think of a person becoming involved in a destructive cult is isolation. And the group seeks to control the environment and control information. And the most extreme expression of that is a compound where everyone lives in group housing and you're kind of in a bubble and you don't get accurate feedback. You don't have anybody but the other group members reinforcing the leader's message, assuming there is a leader. And in my book, Cults Inside Out, I have a chapter on assessment and a chapter defining a destructive cult. But there are three things that you look for. One, an absolute totalitarian leader that is a dictator and has no meaningful accountability, no transparency. And the leader becomes an object of worship. And the followers are focused on that leader. And then two, the leader uses coercive persuasion, thought reform, and influence techniques to gain undue influence over the people that follow him or her. And you can see that because they're acting against their own best interest, but consistently in the best interest of the leader. So like free labor and the leader benefits, or giving the leader sexual favors and cash, or whatever is in the leader's interest, but not necessarily theirs. And then finally, that the leader uses his or her undue influence to hurt people. So the net result is your family member, your daughter, your son is involved in a group that is exploiting him or her and taking advantage of them and in some way doing damage. And that varies by degree from group to group. So some groups are a lot worse than others that have been called cults.
Okay, I appreciate that. That does kind of clear some things up for me. And I think for the layman, which I consider myself a layman on many things, we tend to just kind of throw that word around, but based on what you described, I would say probably not, although I do find the behavior odd. Right?
Is there kind of an absolute leader of this compound?
Have no idea.
That's where you start getting into assessing. You're having a conversation with the person who's involved in a group, and you're asking them questions. You're saying, "Hey, is there a leader? How is the group structured? How does the group support itself, et cetera, et cetera?" And then you start digging into and going into the weeds, and you find out more about the group, and then you kind of take that and compare it to the characteristics of a destructive cult, and then you either come up with, hey, it's a weird group, but they're not hurting anybody, and it's relatively benign, and they have democratic governance and some type of financial transparency, or it keeps looking more and more ominous because red flags keep coming up. Right.
Okay. So that makes a lot of sense. When I think cult, I'm thinking, something like, the Doomsday Cult or David Koresh, that kind of thing. I would imagine there's, dozens, if not hundreds, that are not in the public eye, right? That we don't even know about.
Totally. Thousands. I would say thousands in North America only, and that I learn about a new group almost, it seems like every day. And the latest thing is the leader is developing a following online through social media, through a web presence. They're Skyping with followers. They're having Google gaggles. They're funneling money through PayPal. And there are actually cults now where you've got people following a leader and they've never even physically interacted with that leader. It's all online, it's all web-based. And that gets kind of scary because let's say you're a parent and you've got a kid. The kid is off on the desktop or laptop or the smartphone in their bedroom, and you don't know who the hell they're talking with and communicating with, and they might be recruited into a destructive group. While you're in another room in the house and they're in their bedroom.
That makes so much sense, but until you said that, I never even would have considered the ability to use our current online world for this type of behavior. But that makes all the sense in the world to me.
Yeah, it's a two-edged sword. For example, I founded and launched the Cult Education Institute database in 1996, and it's huge, culteducation.com, free to the public. And you can find the history of various groups. You can use the search engine of the site and find out all kinds of stuff about groups before you get involved. You need to do that. But on the other side of the sword is the cutting edge of the groups themselves, their web presence, their ability to project themselves online. So you can unravel them online. You can find out all their secrets online if they're a well-known group, like, for example, Scientology. Instead of paying Scientology a lot of money, you can find out what they reveal to you at operating Thetan level 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 8, instead of waiting like Tom Cruise and paying out a lot of money. You can go online and find out what they really are all about. And it's something that they really were upset about when the internet began. I mean, the idea of sharing all that information. But at the same time, there are groups that recruit and suck money up from followers online and use the social media for their own gain.
So, it's funny you mentioned Scientology, because there were two groups specifically I was going to ask you about. One was Scientology, and the other, and this is because I'm worried about a friend of mine. In fact, he's a mutual friend of Andy and I, the New England Patriots. I'm just curious, is Tom Brady that guy, that evil leader that we're thinking he is? And based on how my friend reacts, I think he might be. So I'm going to look into.
You could say, Tom Brady. If Tom Brady says that he didn't rig his balls, and I'm talking about footballs here, that he didn't rig it, and make it one way or the other. And then a true Patriots fan, I guess, would say, well, whatever Tom says is right, and whatever Tom says is wrong. And you can see a kind of cult-like response there. But I think there's a big difference between what we could call a cult following, like people following the Grateful Dead, rock and roll, and Jerry Garcia was doing his thing, and there are all these people that would go from concert to concert, and they called them the Deadheads. And then later, many of them would follow the Fish, another rock band. I guess they were the Fish Heads. So it just, that's a cult following, like Elvis fans, Trekkies, or whatever. When it becomes a destructive cult, you have this dictator that has absolute control over the people. And that's probably the salient, most single outstanding feature of a destructive cult is the presence of an all-powerful leader that becomes an object of worship. And really, the members are persuaded to let go of their independent critical thinking through the group indoctrination process and allow the leader to make value judgments for them. And that's how, Scientology, it kind of creeps up on you slowly. But ultimately, that's what L. Ron Hubbard designed, is a kind of a funnel. And he pulls you through in the training and everything. And you end up basically embracing his worldview. And you can become a kind of pawn of Scientology.
Well, Rick, that's kind of wanted to ask you, what is it about someone's psyche that allows them to get kind of trapped into these cults, I guess, this way of living and thinking?
I have done over 500 interventions to get people out of cults across the U.S. and internationally. And amongst those 500, 5 medical doctors that I worked with. One was an orthopedic surgeon, one was an anesthesiologist. What I found is that the most intelligent, the most highly educated people can be tricked and trapped in a destructive cult. And the only thing that I think they might have in common is that maybe they were going through a rough patch in their life at the particular time that somebody approached them with the pitch for the group that is called a cult. And really that pitch could have been done by somebody who was a coworker, a friend, a family member, somebody they trusted, and it was a bait and switch kind of con where they were told one thing and then later they find out it's really different once they get in. So what we're talking about is a combination of somebody being vulnerable, being needy, emotionally needy, and going through a bad patch, and a group that's very predatory and very skilled at running a bait and switch con on someone, which is really what, in my opinion, destructive cults are all about.
Yeah, so I was watching the documentary on the Rajneesh cult, and exactly what you said, a lot of those folks seemed very intelligent. So just, I'm baffled. I don't know how, although Chad and I have been in I guess you could call it a cult now for, the last 60 years combined between the two of us, at least?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, called the U.S. Navy.
Well, you could read the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert J. Lifton, and he analyzed the way in which North Korea during the Korean conflict was able to isolate in POW camps individuals and then change their thinking. And he studied them. That was the thought reform that was done to military prisoners, civilian prisoners by the North Koreans. And you could take the 8 criteria that Lifton lists, and you could apply it to the Marine Corps basic training, and you could see, hey, that's kind of what they're doing there. But the difference between the military, when the military puts you through basic training, and a cult, is that a cult does it under a deceptive guise. The military says, hey, you signed up to be in the Navy. You knew that you were going to go through basic. You're going to go through basic with us. We're going to pay you. You're going to have benefits. And we've got a chain of command, which ultimately is responsible to a democratically elected government. And that's the way the Navy works. But we are going to use coercive persuasion during basic training. So what? You knew that. You knew basic was going to be tough. That's the way it is. And if you sign up for the Marine Corps, it's tough. But when you get involved with a cult, they don't tell you that. They kind of throw it out as all, squishy and nice, and everything's going to be pretty, and they don't tell you, hey, we're going to break you in basic, and we're going to remake you into the ideal military person that will serve our country. They tell you something completely different. And I think that's why people don't understand how somebody like Tom Cruise or John Travolta or whomever, Beck, the rock musician, could get involved in Scientology because they think, well, wow, that's kind of wacky. It's kind of crazy space alien opera stuff. How does somebody get into that? And they get in because they were sucked in slowly and they didn't understand what they were getting into.
Go ahead, Chad.
Go ahead, Andy. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I was in Fleet Week, New York, 2008, and we were walking down. I don't even know where it was. Doesn't matter. But we had a couple individuals that came out and tried to grab us and say, "Hey, just come in, and we'd like to welcome you, and you can have some free popcorn and drinks, and we just want you to watch this movie." And immediately, all my red flags are popping off in my head. And the guy I was with was, he was engaged in a few libations earlier in the evening. But he's like, well, let's just go check it out. How bad can it be? It was a Scientology, I guess, recruitment center. I don't know, for lack of a better term, but it was really creepy.
Yeah, well, that they have the free personality test, and then they have the basic film, and they have a communications course that seems pretty benign. And no matter what you do when you answer the questions to the personality test, they're going to say, hey, we think we can see things that we can do for you. We see weaknesses in you that we can fix. And so that becomes, the bait to pull you into Scientology. And then you get involved in what's called auditing or spiritual counseling, where you talk to this person who's an auditor and you hold a couple of tin cans, like metal cans that are connected to a box called the e-meter. And that basically is part of what could be seen as a lie detector. And it shows when you're nervous, the tension in your hands, and it's a galvanic response measuring apparatus. And so that enables the auditor to know when to drill down on something, because he knows, oh, I see the needle moving, this guy's nervous about this, so I'm going to drill down into that. And you're confessing, you're giving them all kinds of information about yourself, and they can then use that on you as they have. If you leave, or if you give them a problem, or if they want to just leverage you. So Scientology is, I've dealt with them for a long time and testified in court as an expert regarding Scientology. And I'll tell you, that is one of the, when somebody gets involved with that, you just hear this big sucking sound at their bank. I mean, because that group really is after the money. They're maxing out credit cards. They're just really paying.
So, what I was going to ask about Scientology, or just kind of comment, right? one of the things, like we all know Tom Cruise and Beck and John Travolta, and there's a lot of people of note, a lot of people in business that are involved with Scientology. And what I wonder is, if you're extremely successful in your personal life, right, you could almost get in this insulated environment where you're used to everybody is telling you yes. Whatever you need, John, whatever you need, Tom, you kind of live in this world. But now I have this group that is telling me what to do, and it's almost like an escape from having to make your own decisions. I don't know if that makes any sense to either of you, but that's kind of what's going on in my head.
Well, I think you're right. I think that for some people, there's this intense feeling of certainty and direction that comes from being in a group that claims to have all the answers. But in reality, they really are just kind of playing with you, I think, because I think that L. Ron Hubbard, in my opinion, and David Miscavige, the current dictator of Scientology, they to some extent they know, or certainly Hubbard knew, that he pulled this fictional kind of narrative out of his ass. So I mean, he was a sci-fi writer. He wrote fiction. And then he comes up with this bizarre explanation for the human condition that you have to pay to learn. It would be the equivalent of, I'm a Christian, but I don't get to find out about Jesus until I've paid my way up to operating Christian level number 3. Then I find out that Jesus died for my sins. That's the equivalent of what Scientology does when they don't tell you about the incident until you hit OT3, which is that space aliens from a galactic federation were dumped here on this planet, and they died here, and their spiritual residue clings to you right now, John, and you are affected by body thetans, BTs, and Scientology is the answer to neutralizing those BTs. Now, if Tom Cruise were told that in the beginning, I think he would have said, this is crazy. This doesn't make any sense. But at the time he was hooked up with Mimi Rogers, that was his girlfriend and his first wife. She had been raised in Scientology, and she just kind of brought him in and told him things like, hey, Tom, this can help you with your reading. You have dyslexia. The study technology of Scientology can be useful to you. There are some communications things that can help you as an actor. It helped me, because Mimi Rogers, a very well-known actress.
Sure.
So that was the deal. Plus, I'm sure he thought, Mimi is hot. I really love Mimi. And she says this is good. And he kind of went into it. And then gradually they just reeled him in. Until right now, as we're talking, he's liquidated all of his houses pretty much. I don't know if he sold the house in Telluride yet, but he's liquidated them in order to live, it appears, in a super penthouse in Clearwater, Florida, on top of a Scientology super block. Tom Cruise might be a brilliant businessman when it comes to acting, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But when it comes to Scientology, he's all in. As they say, he's drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, my wife definitely cannot stand Tom Cruise, but I definitely want to come back to Scientology. But what Rick, I wanted to say, when I first came across you, I was actually researching cults and just a generic interest. But I came across the episode of 48 Hours that you did. And that was pretty interesting. And I wanted to ask you if you still kept in touch with her, or whatever happened to Aaron at the end of that.
Aaron Klun, who was at that time 14 years old and now is a father and has his own kids. He went on to have a good life, and he really was grateful to his mom. that she did the intervention that pulled him out of the group called the Potter's House, because they were telling him his mother was demonic, she was satanic, and he kept running away to be with the group. And finally his mother brought me in and we did the intervention. And at first he was very hostile, as you can see from the 48 hours that was done in 1989. But then subsequently he just really realized my mother just absolutely loves me totally. And I have a coffee mug sitting behind me that his mother gave me in Anchorage before I flew out, and it's of a polar bear. Let me get it. Here it is. Can you see it? It's of a mama polar bear. Let's see. It's a mama polar bear hugging her baby bear. And this was given to me by Marna Perrin when I was in Anchorage. And she said, the message is, don't mess with mama bear. Don't ever mess with mama bear. And so she's still up in Alaska. And last I heard, Aaron is up there and they're close. And he's close with his family and he's a dad.
Well, that's great.
Good news.
Yeah, it's nice to hear a happy ending for a change. So much tragedy in the world. But that kind of leads me into what are some of the warning signs if you suspect a family member or a friend that's involved in the cult?
Well, I think what John laid out is very, very pivotal. The first thing you look for is social isolation. You look for someone withdrawing from family and old friends, communicating less and less, and becoming embedded in a particular group, and that taking over their life. And also, when you start asking about the group, if the leader is always right and there's no legitimate reason to criticize the leader or to leave the group, and anyone who criticizes the leader is negative, and anybody that leaves the group has committed some kind of sin by leaving, then you realize this is not a regular group. Because typically, when somebody joins a church or a club or some organization, it doesn't take over their life like that. And the leadership can be criticized, and people can shop around. They can move from one church to another, and they're not vilified or made to feel like, oh, this is terrible that you left this group. So I think when you see those kind of warning signs, you see the person in particular withdrawing from their family and friends and becoming increasingly isolated. And that whenever you have a discussion with them, they obsessively talk about this group and the people in the group and the leader, and you cannot they can't identify anything wrong with the group. Any criticism of the group it's just not there.
Interesting. So,
hey, Andy, real quick. So I hate to do this, and this is why I'm the worst co-host in the world. I've just gotten called from work 3 different times, so I need to get off of here for a few and figure out what's going on.
All right, buddy.
So I may dial back in.
Yeah, that's fine. And if not, I'll see you probably Sunday evening or Monday.
Right. Rick, I appreciate it. If I don't dial in, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Now we can talk about you. But so with those warning signs, if you suspect you have somebody that's in need of help, how would you go about getting help for them?
Well, I think that that's the reason that I wrote the book Cults Inside Out, so that people would have, if you will, a kind of manual that they could reflect upon. So there's a chapter on assessment, there's a chapter on preparation for an intervention, but there's also a chapter on just coping strategies for people who don't know if they want to do an intervention and they're just trying to think their way through it and cope with someone who they believe is in a destructive cult. But the first and foremost thing to remember, if you have someone in your family or a friend that is involved in a group you suspect being a destructive cult, is to not be critical, not be confrontational, not get involved into heated arguments with them, and instead, maintain your line of communication, keep it friendly, be loving as a family member, if that's your place, and make sure that the lines of communication stay open. Because if you're confrontational and you get in their face and you say, "Oh, this group is a cult, and you're crazy to be involved in this group, and you're brainwashed," they're going to go back to the group with those statements, and the group leadership is going to then say, "Hey, these people are trouble," and then they're going to start shutting down communication. They're going to start coaching that person in the group to shut down communication, and you don't want that. You want to keep the communication lines open, whether it's because you hope to do an intervention or just because you want your family member, your friend, to know that they are not alone, and if they leave the group, you're there for them.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Since you brought up your book, if someone that listens wants to find your book, where can they find it at?
The book is available on Amazon.com. So it's called Cults Inside Out, How People Get In and Can Get Out. And you can download it through Kindle. It is really a compendium of information, historical information on modern cults, beginning with Charles Manson and going forward to today. And then also it really has examples through case vignettes of interventions I've actually done, showing how people come out. And then there also is a chapter on recovery. So I think with the 18-page bibliography, with all the research footnotes, this is a book that really can help people to get their head around a really bad situation and give them really solid information and research that they can use.
That's great. Listen, I'm really a fan of your work, and I like what you're doing, but I just want to play devil's advocate for a couple of minutes. So I saw, and of course I don't know all of your work, but especially with the 48 hours thing, I saw a chance where a possibility could arise where someone can maybe say that it's kidnapping or false imprisonment when you're trying to deprogram some of these folks. So how do you protect yourself from that?
Well, I used to participate and do deprogramming with adults, with the parents, of course, being responsible for those adults, and the parents would hire security and they would hold an adult against his or her will, and I would work with them. But I went through quite a legal mess with the Church of Scientology and with Scientology lawyers. And in 1990, a long time ago, I decided that the only type of intervention that I would participate in where it was involuntary would be with a minor child, as you saw in the 48 hours. So I still do involuntary interventions with minor children under the direct supervision of their custodial parent, which is perfectly legal, and the court would recognize that. But if a parent comes to me and they say, "Look, my son, my daughter is in this compound," and they come out periodically, and the only way that I can do an intervention is to grab them and, "Will you please help me?" I will say, I'm very sorry, but no, I will not help you, because I just cannot handle the legal complications that could arise. And quite frankly, either could you. You could be arrested, and even though you have the best intention and what you're doing may be morally and ethically correct in the sense that your loved one is under undue influence and you're trying to help them, and the group could be dangerous. I mean, some of these groups are very volatile. Some prohibit members from seeking medical care, so that can be quite bad. People dying from medical neglect. And I deeply sympathize with the parents who feel like they do want to kidnap their adult child to save their life. But I cannot cooperate in that type of intervention.
Yeah, a lot of your opponents seem to think that deprogramming is wrong. I'm not sure I follow their logic, but can you speak to some of that a little bit?
Well, I think if something is on the up and up, it can bear scrutiny. If a group is legitimate and they're not a bad group and they're not hurting anyone, they're not exploiting anyone, they're not playing any mind games with anyone, then if you have a discussion, which is all an intervention is, it's an educational exchange, a dialogue about the group, about what is a destructive cult, how does coercive persuasion work, and why is your family so upset? Why are they concerned about you? And if the group is legitimate and if the group is sincere, then the group itself will say, well, of course, why not? Go ahead and discuss whatever you want with your family and the expert they brought in, because we have nothing to hide. We're okay. We're on the up and up, and we can handle the scrutiny. We have not misrepresented ourselves to you. So I think that's the flip side of the criticism, that what critics of deprogramming or cult intervention work are typically saying is that they don't want the people that are involved in these groups to have a discussion, a dialogue about the group, about persuasion and influence techniques and so on, because they have something to hide. If they didn't, they would say, what the heck? Talk until the cows come home. We have nothing to hide.
Sure. I have a friend that is a former Jehovah's Witness, and the way he describes it is he escaped from being a Jehovah's Witness. So I'd like your thoughts a little bit on that group. Are they a cult? Or are they just a little eccentric?
In my opinion, Jehovah's Witnesses historically began as a cult, in the sense that they were the total absolute followers of Charles Taze Russell, the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were in fact called the Russellites. And then after Russell died, the organization was taken over by another man known as Judge Rutherford, who was also a dictator. And then subsequent to Rutherford's death, power devolved to what is now the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, which is about a dozen old white guys who run the entire organization, which is a multi-billion-dollar religious empire. So in my opinion, yeah, it started out as what can be seen as a personality-driven cult. It continued that way for a while. Today, I would regard it as a very authoritarian and, in my opinion, destructive religious organization. They hurt people through their policies regarding disfellowshipping and shunning, and also their policies regarding blood transfusions. There are people that die every year because they are Jehovah's Witnesses and they don't have a blood transfusion, and they die because they believe, according to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which is the official name of Jehovah's Witnesses, that it is a terrible sin to get a blood transfusion. So the courts have had to intercede when minor children are involved, and children have received transfusions in life-threatening situations, even though their parents tried to stop it. The court would intercede. So I have heard, I don't know how many horrible accounts of people who have suffered and been hurt by Jehovah's Witnesses, and I regard it as a very authoritarian and quite frequently very destructive organization.
Well, I could definitely attest to the blood transfusion thing. I'm actually an emergency room nurse in the Navy, and I've had to deal with those situations in the past. But it's definitely, especially even trickier when you have government employees involved. It's a hot mess. But did I read correctly that you had actually been involved in the deprogram of some of the Branch Davidians?
Yes, I actually deprogrammed two Branch Davidians. One was David Block, who was he was actually a person who lived in the compound before the raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and he was interviewed by the BATF, and his testimony was cited in the affidavit, which was attached to the warrant for the arrest of David Koresh, who I knew as Vernon Howell, which was his given name. And Vernon Howell, he wasn't always as bad as he ended up. I mean, at one point, he was a lot more businessy and more pragmatic. But like many cult leaders, he became, kind of influenced by, if you will, by the echo chamber that he lived in, where he was always being praised, always being obeyed. Everything he said was right. And he became intoxicated with that, in my opinion. And then I also did an intervention during the Waco Davidian standoff. That is, there were 51 days when the group was surrounded by federal officers, and there was a standoff after the initial raid failed, and there were BATF officers who were shot and killed. There were Davidians who were shot and killed in the initial shootout. And then 51 days went on with the standoff. Now, during that standoff, there was a young woman who was locked out, literally, of the compound when she was visiting with her parents. And so I was then retained by that family, and I did a successful intervention to get her out of the mindset of believing that the end of the world was upon us, and that David Koresh was going to judge the world, and that this was Armageddon. I mean, that's what she believed when I first met her.
So I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine who was actually on the Office of Special Counsel investigating the whole Waco incident, and it was it's very interesting to get that side of it from what he could reveal. Still certain things that he couldn't, but that was a hot mess. But so how, without giving any trade secrets away or anything like that, but how do you go about deprogramming someone?
Well, first of all, and I go into great detail in my book, there's a whole chapter on preparation for an intervention and intervention. Basically, I break it down into 4 blocks. After going through the process of assessment and establishing that the group is a destructive influence and that it is a problem, and then the next step would be preparation with those people who will attend the intervention, and then you do the intervention. And the intervention can be seen in 4 blocks. One is a discussion of defining a destructive cult, and you go through the characteristics, and you're asking the question, does the group or organization or leader that you're involved with parallel these core characteristics, these patterns of behavior, this structure? And then number 2, you go through what is coercive persuasion, thought reform, influence techniques, the tricks of the trade, if you will. And does the group that you're in use these tricks? And how has it affected you? How has it affected your life? And then number 3, what is the history of this group in specific that you might not know that you should know to make a more informed decision about going forward with your involvement with this group? Are they withholding information from you? Are there secrets that you don't know that you should know? Then that would be discussed. And then finally, the 4th block is, why did your family or your spouse or your adult children bring this intervention about? Why? What were their concerns? What did they see in you, your behavior, your affect, your change in your life? Why did they decide, hey, something is going very wrong and we need to do an intervention? And at that point, of course, family members are speaking and saying, this is why we're concerned, and this is what we saw, and they're giving their firsthand accounts. So you have those 4 blocks, and the intervention typically will take 3, possibly 4 consecutive days, and the preparation will take a day. And of course, there are now many conversations with the family that might take place by Skype or by phone before I arrive and do the preparation day.
Mm-hmm. I don't mean to change the subject, but you've got some interesting looking monkeys going on in the background there. I'm not sure what that's all about.
Those were made in Mexico, and that's a kind of Mexican pottery called talavere, and it's all hand done, and I just think they're cool, and so there's always a little bit of monkey business in my office on the top of my bookcase.
Man, you stole my thunder.
If you look over my other shoulder, you'll see an Action Life figure. Mm-hmm. Can you see it?
I sure do.
Yeah, that is Joseph Seed, the lead character in Far Cry 5 by Ubi Soft, which is the most successful of the Far Cry series. Far Cry 5 is a video game where you, as a federal agent, are dropped into a cult compound in the middle of Montana. And everything goes sideways. There's a meltdown. It's a hot mess. And you've got to find a way out. And that guy over my shoulder is an action figure of the leader of the destructive cult. And I worked with Ubi Soft in the creation and the development of Far Cry 5. And when it was released last year, I traveled to Europe, Australia, California, and Canada for the rollout of the game. And it's just an incredible game. Anybody out there that knows about Far Cry and has played video games knows how realistic Far Cry is. And that's what Ubisoft sought to do with Far Cry 5 and why I was hired, so that the game would be as real as possible when it brought you into the world of this cult.
That's pretty awesome. I'm not into video games. However, that would be, I guess, one. If there was one, I would probably be interested in that one. But that's pretty amazing. But yeah, you definitely stole my thunder with the whole monkey business thing. But that's all right. Listen, I want to ask you, in your opinion, there's got to be certain levels of cults and whatnot. But what are the most dangerous ones out there today?
Well, I think that now we're seeing these very extreme, polarized groups that reflect certain religious ideologies. In my opinion, ISIS, the Islamic State, headed by Baghdadi as its caliph, was a destructive cult, as was Al Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden. And we can also see groups that are just viciously racist. On the white side, we can see groups in the Christian identity fold, which is the idea that it's called British Israelism, where Israel, or the chosen people of God, are the white race, are Europeans, etc., and everyone else is evil. And we also see on the other side the black Israelites, who believe that Israel and the chosen people of God are African Americans who came to this country as slaves, and that they are the chosen people and the tribes of Israel. And they disdain and denigrate the white race and lift up the black race as supreme. And these groups have been very intense, often violent. Eric Rudolph, who was the Olympic bomber, who's now in prison, he was part of that Christian white identity movement. He was part of a group called the House of Israel, led by Dan Gayman in Missouri. And then we also see the Yahweh Ben Yahweh group in Florida, which was linked to murders. That was part of the Black Israelite movement. And also the Nuwabians that were led by Malachi York in Georgia. That was part of more or less the Black Israelite movement. And York is now serving a life prison sentence as well. So there are these violent racial identity groups with absolute leaders, and those are kind of scary. And then there are the groups that are not necessarily prone to violence, but really hurt a lot of people. And I think when you talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, you're talking about a pernicious group, in my opinion, that hurts people every day. And because of its size, that's a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we keep hearing about Scientology, and Leah Remini has done this show, Scientology and the Aftermath, in which she interviews people that have been hurt by Scientology. And a lot of times their stories are just incredibly sad, where, for example, a woman was told to have an abortion who was a full-time staffer in Scientology, or someone that was told they had to disconnect from their family, or their family was told to disconnect from them when they left Scientology. That's the equivalent of shunning and disfellowshipping in Jehovah's Witnesses, where you just cut people off. And even though they're your blood, they're your family, you cease to communicate with them or have anything to do with them. That can be tremendously painful to the people that are shunned or disconnected from. And of course, I get complaints about Scientology simply on the basis that people just max out their credit cards and just go under with Scientology. And on a practical level, also, I would point out that there are many multi-level marketing schemes that employ coercive persuasion and influence techniques in a way to suck people in, and people lose a lot of money. They lose a lot of time, years of their life devoted to an MLM that they really don't benefit from.
Yeah, I've watched a couple of Leah Remini's shows, and they're very interesting. And if you wouldn't see a lot of the evidence that she had with her on those shows, you would think that somebody's just making this up. It's too crazy to almost conceive. But yeah, you're right. There's definitely a lot of weird and scary shit out there. What about the Antifa? I know they're not really a cult by definition, but the whole socialist, or not social, well, I guess kind of socialist, but the anti-fascist movement in America today?
Well, I think there's a polarization that's going on in the United States politically that's very sad. So you have the extreme on the left, the anti-fascist people that you mentioned, and then on the other side you have people who only want to watch Fox News, or people that only want to watch MSNBC. Mm-hmm. And they create a kind of social media information bubble around themselves, and they have no conversation with the other side. And so on the left, there's the rigid political correctness, and on the right, there can be often religious certitude. But I think the important thing is to talk to each other.
Absolutely.
And I think that though I don't regard these factions as cults, I rather see them as echo chambers. And I think that we should try to permeate those bubbles and talk to each other, because I think that by communicating, we may find, especially as Americans, that we have more in common than we don't have in common.
Oh, sure.
And that we share a commitment to our country and to our society, and we have to build bridges. But what worries me is the way in which certain factions exhibit a kind of bunker mentality, where they just hunker down and double down, and they don't want to talk to anybody. And I think that's in no one's best interest.
Sure. It's a tribalism mentality, for sure. I had a guy, I'm more center than anything, but I had a guy that was my office mate when I was in Virginia that was very liberal. And some of the best conversations I've ever had have been with him. I didn't agree with all of them, and he certainly didn't agree with everything I talked about, but it was eye-opening to say the least, and we had a great time. So I agree with you. We just need to talk to each other. And this whole tribalism, this party line, it's garbage. I quit watching news because of it. But
yeah, it makes it difficult to watch the news. I mean, I find myself relying more on Google Newsfeed. And
definitely.
I hope Google isn't rigging it one way or the other. I don't think so. But I can then, look at, many different sources. And of course, in my professional life, I've been interviewed by Fox, I've been interviewed by MSNBC, CNN, Associated Press. And so I kind of, go to those many news outlets. And again, I think they share something in common, which is whether they're on the right or the left, they don't appreciate destructive cults that hurt people. And it's apolitical. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's someone that's a Fox News commentator or someone that's on MSNBC. Both can understand that victimizing children and taking advantage of people is wrong.
Absolutely. When it comes to the kids, that's where I know most Americans, but specifically myself, that's where I draw the line. I've told my wife several times that if somebody ever did anything to our kids, just plan on not seeing me anymore, because I'm sure they're going to lock me up. But the kids are so innocent. But listen, Rick, I've taken up a lot of your time already today, and I think we should probably wrap this up. But I am very appreciative of you coming on and doing the show. I've learned a lot. I know if Chad would have stuck around, he would have learned a lot too. But I'll give him hell for that later. But one last time before we sign off here, can you tell folks where they can find your book?
Yes, you can find the book Cults Inside Out at Amazon.com, and you can download it through Kindle. And you can also find the database of the Cult Education Institute, which was launched in '96, huge database, at culteducation.com.
Excellent. And do you have another website that you want to throw out there? Or is that primarily the main one?
There's also cultnews.net,
okay,
where people can get a news feed and they can see breaking cult stories. They can also follow me on Twitter or on Facebook, and every day I will be sharing with them breaking cult stories that are of interest about groups that are becoming newsworthy because of the fact that they are hurting people and attracting attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, Rick, without taking any more of your time, I've got tiles falling on my head here. I don't know if you saw that or not. But anyway, thank you so much for being on the show, and hopefully we can keep in touch. And if anything I could ever do for you, probably not, but please let me know.
Well, email me when it's up and running, and then I'll link to it. I really would appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I sure will. Rick Ross, everyone. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We will talk to you soon. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Nothing's Off the Table, the podcast where no subject is too taboo to discuss. Find us on iTunes, Facebook, and on Instagram. Nothing's Off the Table is a Madsis Productions podcast.